When you imagine ancient Egypt, you likely picture grand monuments, pyramids towering under a blazing sun, and golden tombs guarded by jackal-headed deities. But today, let's drift somewhere a little less monumental and a bit more mundane. Close your eyes and let the Nile's breeze pass through your mind as we step into the daily life of ordinary Egyptians who, thousands of years ago, sought not just to survive, but to do so in relative comfort, even under the relentless heat. You see, the Egyptian sun was as constant as the Nile's flood, a furnace that bore down on both noble and servant alike. How did they endure the midday blaze when temperatures in the shade could climb well past what we'd call comfortable? They didn't have air conditioners or handheld fans buzzing at the flick of a switch. They had ingenuity and cones of scented fat. Let's set the scene. It is around 1400 BCE, somewhere in the 18th dynasty. In a wealthy household just beyond the main courtyard shaded with date palms, you might find a young servant girl preparing for her duties. She rises before dawn when the air still holds a hint of coolness. Her hair is freshly washed, her linen dress clings lightly to her damp skin, and above her crown sits a curious thing, a cone of perfumed, hardened fat. These cones were not just decorative. They were carefully crafted, laboriously made from animal fat or beeswax mixed with expensive perfumes, myrrh, frankincense, or fragrant resins gathered from across Egypt's vast trade routes. When placed on the head, often secured in the elaborate wigs that were popular among wealthier families, they would slowly melt over the course of the day. Now, you might wonder, why would anyone willingly let a cone of melting fat dribble through their hair? Yet to an ancient Egyptian, it was an ingenious solution. The slow melt released a continuous veil of fragrance that masked the pungency of sweat and heat. And there was more, the oils kept the scalp moisturized, helping to protect the hair and skin from the dry, scorching climate. Picture a gathering in a noble's garden. Guests recline on woven mats under linen awnings. Musicians play harps and flutes in the background, while servants move delicately among them, balancing trays of figs, dates, and diluted wine. On the heads of these guests, the perfumed cones gleam faintly in the dappled shade, promising relief as the day lengthens. As the fat melts, it mingles with sweat and cools the skin ever so slightly, a primitive air conditioner by any other name. The practice of wearing these cones is immortalized on the painted walls of tombs. Archaeologists have found countless depictions of men and women, often adorned with garlands of lotus flowers. Another symbol of fragrance, with these small, pointed cones perched atop their wigs or hair. Until the early 20th century, many scholars debated whether these cones were simply symbolic. Were they literal, or an artistic shorthand for status and luxury? Then evidence began to emerge that they were indeed real. Residues found on ancient combs, wigs, and even the wrappings of mummies pointed to the use of scented fats and waxes. Chemical analysis of certain burial items revealed traces of perfumed resins and animal fats, confirming what the tomb paintings had long suggested. These cones were not just for show, they were a quiet but vital comfort in a world of unforgiving heat. You might imagine that only the elite could afford such luxuries. And for the most part, you'd be right. To ordinary laborers, the men who hauled blocks for pyramids or dredged irrigation canals, the cones were likely out of reach. But the idea of perfuming oneself was not. The Egyptians, regardless of status, were keenly aware of bodily hygiene. A peasant might rub scented oils into his skin, while an artisan's wife might dab her neck with a bit of fragrant resin saved from market day. These humble gestures reveal something profound. In the midst of sand, sweat, and survival, the ancient Egyptians carved out small luxuries that softened daily life. Their burial customs, after all, speak to a people who saw a continuity between the pleasures of this life and the next. If you would spend your days lounging in a perfumed garden in life, you ought to enjoy the same in death. Hence the painted walls of tombs, covered with images of feasts, flowers, and those curious cones perched on elegant wigs, but beyond comfort. The perfumed cone held another layer of significance. Smell was more than a nicety. It was a marker of civilization. The scent of sweet myrrh set the noble apart from the commoner, just as it separated the living from the dead. Priests would burn incense to please the gods, masking the odors of sacrifice in daily offerings. Pharaohs were said to be born from the sweet breath of the divine, an idea that bound pleasant fragrance to spiritual purity. Imagine, now, a young scribe in the service of the temple. He wakes before dawn, steps out onto a stone courtyard cool under his bare feet, and prepares for another long day of copying sacred texts. He adjusts the cone in his hair, perhaps gifted by a wealthy patron, and as he dips his reed brush into ink, the faint aroma of the melting fat calms him, reminding him of order and civility. Amid the harshness of the world beyond the temple's walls, it is this mundane beauty, this blend of the practical and the symbolic, that makes the story of the perfumed cones so quietly remarkable. They were not marvels of engineering like the pyramids, nor treasures like Tutankhamun's golden mask. They were ordinary comforts, ephemeral as the desert wind, yet captured forever in pigment and plaster. As you drift now through this ancient scene, consider the people who wore these cones. Imagine their conversations, their laughter beneath the awnings, the slow drip of perfumed fat down the nape of a neck. Think of the artisans who shaped the cones, the traders who carried frankincense from the land of Punt, and the distant hum of everyday life beneath a sun that would not relent. When we study history, we often chase the grand and the glorious, but sometimes it's in these small, melting moments, the hush of a shaded courtyard, the quiet dignity of smelling sweet in a world of sweat, that we find the truest connections to those who came before us. So, tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, let your mind linger on one simple question. How many other forgotten comforts did they craft long ago to make the desert feel just a bit more bearable? You now know how these curious perfumed cones sat gently atop wigs and braids, releasing their slow trickle of fragrant oil. But what of the hands that made them? What did it take, in the heat of ancient Egypt, to turn animal fat and exotic resins into small pyramids of scented luxury? Imagine the city of Thebes at the height of its power. Dusty streets winding through, mud brick houses, bustling markets thrumming with chatter and the distant bray of donkeys. Here, in a cramped workshop shaded by tattered linen awnings, a perfumer begins his day long before the sun hits its peak. The craft of scent was a serious trade in ancient Egypt. Perfumes were not merely indulgences but essential to ritual, medicine, and daily hygiene. The perfumer, or caraper, as they were sometimes called, held a respected place in the temple, economy, and in wealthy households alike. Their skills were handed down in family lines, each generation refining recipes and methods, so delicate that even today we can only partially recreate them. Let's step into this workshop for a moment. You stand beside low wooden tables smeared with sticky resins. Jars of myrrh, frankincense, and sweet-smelling balms sit open, filling the air with a heady blend of sharp spice and honeyed warmth. Behind you, lumps of animal fat, goat, sheep, or ox are gently warming over clay stoves. The fat must be pure and free of impurities, else the final cone would spoil too quickly under the sun's relentless heat. There is no rushing this process. First, the fat is rendered and strained through linen cloths, sometimes more than once, until it is pale, smooth, and free of grit. The perfumer then pounds resins and fragrant woods into a powder. Myrrh from Punt, cinnamon from distant lands across the sea, calamus and lotus, each carefully weighed according to a recipe older than the perfumer himself. Oil from pressed nuts or seeds is blended with the powdered resins. Sometimes honey or wine is added, helping to bind the mixture. The result is a sweet-smelling paste, which is kneaded into the warm, liquid fat. This concoction must be stirred constantly, lest the heat ruin the fragrance. Once mixed, the perfumed fat is poured into molds. Some were simple cones, shaped by hand or pressed into clay forms lined with linen. Others were more elaborate, shaped into small lotus buds or domed pyramids. These molds would rest in the shade to cool and harden. When ready, they would be wrapped in linen, stored in cool jars, and delivered to wealthy clients or the temple, where priests and priestesses would wear them during festivals and rites. It is no small irony that while these cones melted away to nothing in daily life, they have survived thousands of years in the art of tomb walls, their fleeting scent, immortalized in pigment. Tomb paintings show banquets, dancers, musicians, and rows of guests with these pointed cones, balanced perfectly on wigs. Adorned with garlands of lotus blossoms, they appear almost weightless, drifting above the everyday burden of heat and dust. But not all cones were reserved for human heads. In the great temples, offerings of scent, cones, incense, and oils were burned or placed before statues of the gods. The gods, it was believed, could not abide the stench of decay or the unclean. Fragrance was divine breath, linking earth and heaven through the simple alchemy of melting fat and smoldering resin. So the perfumers did not merely cater to vanity. They were guardians of purity, ensuring that sacred spaces smelled sweet enough to welcome deities. They made healing balms for the sick, burial ointments for the dead, and the everyday, perfumes that let a merchant's wife feel respectable under the oppressive sun. Now, imagine the cone once it left the workshop. In the grand households of Thebes or Memphis, servants were often tasked with applying the cones to wigs and hair. Wigs themselves were crafted from human hair or plant fibers, meticulously woven and stored on stands when not in use. For the wealthy, wigs were not merely adornments but protection, a shield against the sun's scorch, a barrier against lice. The cones would be placed gently at the crown, secured with a small pin or nestled between the woven braids. During festivals, dancers and singers often wore fresh flowers along with the cone. Garlands of lotus blossoms, threaded with reeds and pinned into wigs, the sweet petals mingling with the cone's melting trail. There is something tender in this image, the care with which a mother might secure a cone on her daughters' head before a festival, or the diligence of a servant ensuring that the cone sits perfectly before guests arrive. It is in these small gestures that history breathes most quietly and most deeply. Yet, for all their subtle power, the cones were not immune to the winds of change. In later dynasties, as trade routes shifted and new scents arrived from faraway lands, the recipes for perfumes evolved. Some cones used beeswax instead of animal fat, prized for its sweeter scent and greater stability in the heat. Some were crafted with local herbs or blended with imported spices that marked Egypt's connection to a wider world. As Greek and Roman visitors came to Egypt in the centuries after, they wrote with fascination about the Egyptians' love of scent. To them, the cones seemed extravagant, exotic, even excessive. Yet these visitors carried home not just tales of monumental temples, but recipes for ointments and perfumes that would shape the bathhouses and apothecaries of Europe for centuries to come. What's remarkable is that something as ordinary as a cone of scented fat could tell such a layered story of trade routes crossing deserts, of household economies balancing luxury and necessity, of artisans who handed down recipes as precious as gold. These cones remind us that comfort and dignity are often carved from the humblest things: a spoonful of fragrant fat, a garland of lotus flowers, a moment of relief beneath the unforgiving sun. As you let your thoughts drift back through these ancient streets and shaded workshops, pause and consider the unseen connections. The resin that sailed on reed boats down the Nile, the frankincense carried by camel across the Arabian sands, the beeswax harvested from hives nestled along the river's fertile banks. Each cone was more than an object. It was a miniature map of Egypt's economy, religion, and daily survival. Each one melted slowly, a reminder that nothing, not even a bit of fragrant fat, was ever truly wasted. Even as it dripped through the strands of a wig, it cooled the head, sweetened the air, and whispered a promise of comfort in a world where luxury was fleeting. So tonight, as you rest, ask yourself this. What other traces of ordinary craft and quiet survival might lie buried, waiting to melt back into our awareness? Like a forgotten cone softening in the midday sun, you've stood in the shaded courtyards where nobles reclined, felt the waxy cones warming gently on wigs woven with human hair, and stepped into the perfumer's cramped, fragrant workshop. But what became of these scented luxuries when the final heat of life faded away? What did a melting cone mean to a civilization so obsessed with the passage from life to death, from the world of the sun to the realm of shadows? Let's begin in the place where so much of Egypt's story ends, the tomb. Tomb walls across the Nile Valley preserve painted echoes of these cones. Generations of artists, chiseling and brushing plaster, seem determined to capture this small detail again and again. Banqueting scenes show families gathered in the afterlife just as they did in life, wearing their finest linen, lotus garlands, and, delicately perched atop each wig, the faintly absurd pointed cones. For the living, the cone melted to cool the scalp, to perfume the air, to cover the sweat and toil of daily survival. But for the dead, for the scenes etched in stone, the cones became more than a cosmetic trick. They were a symbol of eternal feasting, eternal fragrance. In the eternal garden promised in the field of reeds, the air would never grow stale. The cone would never fully melt. The sweetness would never fade. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? That in an unforgiving desert world, the Egyptian vision of paradise was not golden thrones and endless power, but a shaded courtyard and a gentle breeze scented with myrrh. The priests who oversaw burial rites understood this well. Oils and unguents made from the same resins that perfumed daily. Life played an essential role in mummification. The body had to be preserved, the spirit protected from the rot that claimed all things. So the same compounds that soothed sunburnt skin in life were now applied to keep the flesh from ruin. Cedar oil, beeswax, bitumen, the practical and the spiritual bound together. Archaeologists have found the residues, lumps of fragrant substances, tucked beside the linen wrappings of mummies, jars still sticky with hardened perfume that once dripped. Just like the cones in the gardens above, they found scent cones left as offerings too, their waxy shapes placed near the heads of the deceased, a final comfort for the long sleep ahead. These discoveries remind us that fragrance was a bridge between wealth and poverty, between temple and household, between life and death. The humble cone was not simply a tool for vanity. It was an affirmation that comfort, cleanliness, and dignity mattered in every realm. Consider the servants who wore them, not just the nobles who could afford them by the dozens. A girl working in a wealthy household, her head shaved to keep lice at bay, might pin a scrap of perfumed fat under her wig before serving her mistress at table. For her, the cone was protection against the heat, but perhaps also a brief chance to feel as if she, too, belonged among the sweet-smelling upper classes. One can imagine her drifting through the market when her wages allowed, hoping to bargain for a tiny scrap of resin to melt into oil. In this way, the cones stitched the daily lives of all Egyptians together, each breath carrying the scent of a civilization, determined not just to endure, but to endure with grace. And what of the perfumers, those keepers of recipes and rituals? They would pass down their craft through generations, each master teaching the next, the delicate balance between fats that would hold their shape, but still melt at just the right pace. They learned to weigh the powder of imported resins, to test the scent on their own skin, to shape the cones with a practiced hand. It is not difficult to see why scent and time became so intertwined. In ancient Egypt, time was cyclical. The sun rose and fell, the Nile flooded and retreated. Crops grew and withered only to grow again. In this endless loop, the cone was a small cycle of its own, solid at dawn, melting by midday, gone by dusk. a reminder that all things fade, yet somehow all things return. As the centuries passed, Egypt's perfumes traveled far beyond its borders. Greek and Roman writers marveled at the sweetness of Egyptian oils. Merchants ferried jars of scented ointments across the Mediterranean. Recipes were adapted and traded, mingling with Syrian, Persian, and later Arabic traditions. Some say these ancient formulas influenced the perfumers of medieval Europe, who distilled rosewater and experimented with fragrant oils in much the same way as their Egyptian ancestors. Yet, oddly enough, the cones themselves did not survive the changing tides of empire. With time, the practice of wearing them faded, just like the last drops of melted fat on a hot afternoon. The Romans preferred oil rubbed directly into the hair. Later generations turned to scented cloths, powders, and eventually glass vials of perfume. But echoes of the cone remain. When modern Egyptologists brush away the sand from a painted tomb wall and see those tiny pointed shapes, they see proof of lives lived not just in grandeur, but in the delicate rituals of daily survival. To study them is to remember that comfort, however fleeting, was worth the effort. So what does this small, melting detail tell us about ourselves? Perhaps that our search for relief or small luxuries is timeless. That in every civilization, no matter how grand its monuments, people have always found ways to soften the edges of harsh reality. A cone of perfumed fat might seem laughably simple to us now, in an age of deodorants and air conditioners, but in its quiet way, it was ingenious, a marriage of chemistry, craftsmanship, and human desire. As you close your eyes tonight, picture that shaded courtyard again. Hear the distant rustle of palm fronds, the gentle strum of a harp, the low murmur of voices carried on the breeze. Among the guests reclining on woven mats, someone reaches up, fingers brushing the warm, fragrant cone melting atop their wig. They know it will not last. But for a few hours the air is sweeter, the heat less cruel. History is often told through wars and dynasties, through the rise and fall of kings. But sometimes it is the small, melting things that linger longest, the soft drip of scented fat, the fragile petals of a lotus flower, the slow sigh of comfort beneath an unrelenting sun. So I'll leave you with this final question to drift on as you rest. What other tiny inventions, born of sweat and sun and simple human longing, shaped the course of history in ways that no towering monument ever could? Sleep well, and when you wake, may you carry this thought sometimes. The quietest comforts are the strongest, threads that hold our past and us together. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture an English countryside in the 12th century, rolling green hills wrapped in mist, small villages scattered like breadcrumbs across farmland. And at the heart of this landscape, a sturdy stone monastery, its walls cool and damp, its arches echoing softly with chants that have risen each dawn for centuries. It's here that our story of monks and beer begins, not in the taverns of rowdy townsfolk, but behind monastery gates, where quiet men devoted to prayer and hard work brewed a drink that would sustain body and soul alike. You might think beer is the domain of boisterous medieval alewives or raucous inns. Yet for generations it was the quiet hands of monks that perfected its craft. It's a mundane, earthy story, but then again, isn't that the point? This is history at its sleepest, an account of barley, yeast, prayer, and survival. Imagine it's just before dawn. The monastery bell tolls matins, the first of 8 daily prayers. Cloaked figures shuffle into the cold stone chapel, the floor rough beneath sandaled feet. Their chants drift upward, each voice joining the other, weaving a thread of sound that binds the monks to their God and to each other. Outside, the night holds the last of its chill, dew forming on rows of barley waiting patiently in the fields. When the final amen echoes into silence, the monks do not return to bed. Their life is a rhythm of devotion and labor. For these men, work is a form of worship, a practical necessity that keeps the community fed and clothed while allowing them to serve pilgrims and the poor. And so they turn from the chapel to the granary, and the brewhouse, a squat building of stone and timber, already warm with the scent of damp grain and the tang of yeast. A Benedictine monastery might house dozens of monks, each with their assigned tasks. Some tend the vegetable garden, others care for sheep and cows, and a select few, the brewer monks, oversee the precious task of transforming water, barley and hops into beer. Why beer? Why not wine? The answer lies partly in the soil. Northern Europe was not the sunny Mediterranean. Vines were difficult to grow. But barley? Barley thrived in cool, damp climates, and it could be stored through harsh winters when fresh food was scarce. Beer was safer than water, too. The brewing process killed harmful bacteria, a fact the monks understood not scientifically but by long observation. Where travelers fell ill drinking from a stagnant well, they stayed healthy sipping a frothy mug of ale. And so, brewing became a daily ritual within these cloistered walls. Some monasteries even gained reputations for the quality of their beer, a humble yet valuable offering to pilgrims passing through. Step now into the brewhouse with me. Inside, a fire glows beneath a large copper kettle. A monk stands over it, stirring the mash, a thick, warm blend of cracked barley and water. The air is heavy with steam. It clings to the stone walls. Mingling with the faint sweetness of malt, the monks did not invent beer. Of course, humans have brewed variations of it for millennia, but they did refine it. Their notes, carefully scratched into vellum, record the proportions of grain to water, the length of the mash, the importance of temperature. In a world where recipes were often passed by memory, these quiet scribes preserved knowledge that would ripple out far beyond the monastery gates. Once the mash is ready, the liquid called wort is drained off, leaving behind a sticky mash of spent grain. Hops, if available, are added now. They're a relatively new addition in the 12th century, slowly replacing the older tradition of flavoring. Beer with grut, a mix of herbs and spices. Hops act as a preservative, giving the beer a longer shelf life. This is practical knowledge, gleaned from observation and careful trial and error. While the beer ferments in great wooden barrels, the monks clean the equipment with diligence bordering on ritual. Cleanliness is next to godliness and essential to good beer. Even a careless bit of leftover yeast could ruin the next batch. So they scrub the copper, rinse the barrels, and sweep the floors of the brewhouse. This is no rowdy alehouse. No spilled beer soaking into dirt floors. In the monastery, brewing is orderly, reverent work. Outside, the monastery's barley fields wait for the next harvest. Monastic estates were self-sufficient ecosystems. Some owned vast tracts of land worked by tenant farmers. Others were smaller, their monks tending the fields themselves. In summer, when the barley was ripe, the monks rose with the sun to cut the golden stalks by hand, gathering them into sheaves to dry in open barns. Every stage of this cycle is tied to the liturgical calendar. Harvest feasts mark the bounty of the barley. Lent, with its fasting and penance, reminds the monks that even beer must be tempered by moderation. During fast days, the monks often drank a richer, more nourishing brew, liquid bread, as they called it, to sustain them through long hours of prayer without solid food. For some orders, the stronger beer brewed for these days was an open secret, a loophole in the strict rules of abstinence. It's easy to imagine the contradictions, the solemn vow of poverty, alongside the well-stocked brewhouse, the silence of prayer halls echoed by the bubbling froth of fermenting ale. Yet this, too, was daily life, a balance between the spiritual and the earthly, between the silence of a cloister and the chatter of a refectory, where mugs clinked and laughter warmed the stone walls. Picture a visiting pilgrim on the road to Canterbury. Dusty and footsore, he arrives at the monastery gates, where a monk welcomes him with a cup of ale, freshly drawn from the barrel. For the pilgrim, this beer is more than refreshment. It is safety, community, and a brief taste of warmth in an unpredictable world. From dawn's first toll to the final bell of Compline, The monks moved through this cycle day after day, season after season. Their brewing was never just about quenching thirst. It was about sustaining a fragile community through harsh winters, feeding weary travelers, and preserving knowledge that would seep beyond the monastery walls to shape an entire continent's drinking habits. As you drift deeper into this world, imagine the steady rhythm of this life. Bells marking the hours, the soft rustle of monks in the fields, the hiss of boiling wort, the cool splash of ale poured into a pilgrim's cup. Nothing grand or heroic, no great battles or kings, just the small, quiet survival of a community that found warmth and sweetness in the simplest grains. So tonight, ask yourself this: what small rituals of our own, repeated daily and barely noticed, might one day be seen as the threads that bound a society together, just as these monks did with their humble barrels of beer? When you picture these monks in your mind, hoods drawn low, hands folded in prayer, it's easy to forget how much of their lives unfolded not in silent stone cloisters but in the damp, earthy brew house and the busy grain fields beyond the monastery gate. Brewing was not an occasional task. It was woven into the fabric of the monastery, its profits and its charity, its health and its survival. Step now deeper into the day. Imagine the monk brewer, sleeves rolled high, working by lamplight as dawn gives way to a pale morning sun. The great barrels of ale, some the size of small wagons, must be tended constantly. The ale ferments in these casks, the froth rising and falling. A living brew watched over with the same care the monks give to their books and relics. Once fermentation is complete, the ale must be transferred to smaller barrels for storage. This is hard, sticky work. The floor of the brewhouse is slick with the drips and spills of the day's labors. Wooden spigots are hammered into place, and the monk lifts his ladle, carefully tasting the beer to judge its strength and flavor. No batch is precisely the same: the quality of the barley, the condition of the yeast, the chill in the stone walls, all these shift the final taste. Brewing was part science, part faith. And then the sharing begins. Monasteries, especially those following the rule of Saint Benedict, were expected to be self-sufficient but also generous. Charity was not a noble gesture. It was an obligation. The beer brewed behind these thick walls did not stay there. It flowed out to the workers who toiled in the monastery's fields and gardens, lay brothers, tenant farmers, laborers who dug drainage ditches and mended walls. These men were given a daily allowance of ale, beer money of a sort, but paid in liquid form. It was not the same strong brew the monks saved for fast days or celebrations. Instead, much of what the monastery produced was what we might call small beer, a weak ale with low alcohol content, nourishing but unlikely to leave anyone tipsy to hoe a row of cabbages or tend a barley field. This was daily fuel, a source of calories and hydration when clean water was unreliable. For peasants who might never see the inside of the abbey's chapter house, the monastery's beer was a lifeline. Imagine a harvest day in high summer. The sun blazes down on golden barley fields ready for the sickle. The monastery's lay workers bend their backs for hours, gathering sheaf after sheaf. When the midday bell sounds, they break for a meal: coarse bread, a slice of cheese, and mugs of cool ale ladled from barrels rolled out to the fields by novice monks. There are no gilded goblets here, only rough wooden cups passed from hand to hand. The beer refreshes and restores. It connects the distant chapel with its solemn chants, echoing through arched windows, to the practical sweat of those who keep the monastery alive. The laborers may never recite the psalms in Latin, but they taste the charity of the brothers in each mouthful of ale. Inside the monastery walls, the monks drink, too, but always in moderation, at least in theory. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and widely followed by European monasteries for centuries after, was clear. We read that wine is by no means a drink for monks. Yet Benedict wisely added, "But since the monks of our day cannot be convinced of this, let us at least agree to drink sparingly, So they did. And when wine was hard to come by in the north, beer took its place, sometimes to the tune of several pints per monk per day. It's a curious contradiction, isn't it? Men who vowed poverty and temperance, yet whose ale cellars brimmed with barrels enough to float a small boat. But life in the Middle Ages was practical. Beer was food. It was medicine. And it was, in its way, a bridge between the sacred and the ordinary. The monastery's ale served another purpose: hospitality. Medieval monasteries were stops along the pilgrimage roads that crisscrossed Europe like veins carrying faith and rumor. Pilgrims trudged for weeks or months to holy sites: Canterbury, Compostela, Rome, their feet raw, their purses light. When they arrived at the monastery gate, they found not only a bed of straw in the guest hall, but also a meal and a cup of ale. Picture the guest master, a monk tasked with greeting visitors, filling clay, mugs from a barrel drawn from the brew house that very morning. He presses the mug into a pilgrim's hand. The weary traveler lifts it, breathes in the sweet, nutty aroma, and drinks. For a moment, he tastes not just barley and hops, but the warmth of a welcome he might not find for another 100 miles. The beer is thick, cloudy, and nourishing, the very opposite of the uncertain water from a roadside ditch. The monastery's brewing was not merely local charity, but sometimes a source of considerable wealth. Some monastic orders, like the Trappist centuries later, became famous for the quality of their beer. Merchants visited, not just to pray or seek blessings, but to negotiate. Casks for sale in nearby towns. Profits paid for books in the scriptorium, repairs to the cloister walls, alms for the poor, candles for the altar. But the rule always reminded monks not to become too attached to earthly gains. Riches were dangerous distractions. The brewhouse was a place for honest work, not vanity. Still, human nature being what it is, tensions arose. Monasteries that brewed particularly good ale might find themselves tempted to expand their production, sell more casks, and slip ever closer to the world's temptations. This tension echoes through monastery records. Some abbots scolded their brothers for drinking too freely, for letting the brewhouse become a place of gossip and idle chatter. Others wrote letters to distant bishops, begging for more land to grow barley so they could brew enough ale to feed their poor. Balance was never easy, not then, not now. So many small details, a monk's cracked hand stained with malt, the hiss of boiling wort, the warmth of ale poured into a pilgrim's mug, remind us that history is not only the tale of kings and wars, but of how people found ways to survive together, to share what they had, to turn a handful of grain into something that could nourish the body and soothe the soul. As you drift further into this world, listen to the echo of the monastery bell, the faint clink of wooden mugs in a stone refectory, the quiet splash of ale poured for a weary traveler who may never know the name of the brewer monk who tended the barrels in the early dawn. And wonder this as you rest: how many more unseen hands shaped our daily comforts, the small acts of craft and kindness that, like a hidden barrel of ale, waited patiently to refresh those in need? Whether that tale is legend or truth, the principle holds. Beer, to these monastic communities, was not just drink but survival strategy. The barrels they rolled out to laborers, the mugs they pressed into pilgrims' hands, the jugs they poured for their own refectory meals, each one told the same story. We endure together. Of course, brewing in monasteries did more than feed the hungry and sustain the monks. Over centuries, it preserved and improved brewing techniques that would shape entire cultures. The methodical written records kept by monastic scribes, exact proportions, notes on temperature and fermentation were far ahead of their time. In an age when many trades relied on word of mouth and memory, the monks' quiet obsession with documentation meant that knowledge was not lost but refined and passed forward. When new ingredients arrived, like hops, which slowly replaced the bitter Groot mixtures in the 12th and 13th centuries, it was often the monasteries that experimented first. Hops added not only a pleasant bitterness but acted as a preservative, giving beer a longer shelf life. This discovery would ripple outward, helping beer become a major commodity across medieval Europe. Towns sprang up around monasteries famed for their brews, and local economies were shaped by the barrels that rolled from cloister gates to bustling marketplaces. In the centuries to come, even as the Reformation shuttered many monastic houses and secular breweries took over, the legacy endured. Some monastic brewing traditions survive to this day. Trappist monks in Belgium still brew ales that are among the most prized in the world, not because they are flashy or novel, but because they carry forward that same old blend of devotion and craft. Yet beyond the technical legacy, there's something more subtle worth savoring. The way these barrels and mugs held communities together. The monks did not hoard their ale for themselves. They shared it with the workers who labored in their fields, the travelers who stumbled through their gates, the local poor who lined up outside the brewhouse door. In each mug, there was more than barley and yeast. There was trust that the world, so unpredictable and harsh, could offer a moment of warmth. Perhaps you can picture it, a winter night. Wind rattling the monastery's wooden shutters, and within the thick walls, the brothers gathered in the refectory. A long table, plain and unadorned, stretches under the flicker of beeswax candles. Bread, cheese, a pot of pottage, and mugs of fresh ale drawn from the day's brewing. They do not speak much. Silence is part of the rule. But they know the warmth in their bellies is proof of their shared labor, their patient tending of barley fields under rain and sun. Even the humblest lay worker, trudging home after mending the stone wall that rings the monastery orchard, might carry a small flask of ale given freely by a monk at the gate. A drink for the road, a taste of charity that lingers far longer than the warmth of the mug. When you think of history's great inventions, you may not picture a monk's cracked hands stirring a copper kettle in the half-light of dawn. But in that simple labor lies a reminder that survival has always depended on these small, quiet acts, the brewing, the tending, the sharing. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let your mind rest on that image. The brewhouse door creaking open to a waiting pilgrim, the warm splash of ale in a cold cup, the soft hiss of a prayer whispered as barrels are sealed tight for the winter ahead. These were not kings or warriors, but ordinary men with ordinary tools, weaving the taste of hope into the daily bread of their communities. So, at the end of this sleepy tale, I leave you with this thought to carry into your dreams. How many of our modern comforts were first shaped not by ambition or conquest, but by the steady hands of quiet souls who found ways to turn the simplest grain into a promise of warmth and survival? For those they would never even meet, close your eyes for a moment. Feel the weight of the sun on your shoulders. A warm wind blows dust across a narrow ridge where the first stones are laid. Beneath your feet, the road stretches onward, a hard, stubborn scar across a wild landscape that once knew only the softness of grass and forest. This is not just any path. This is the Via Appia, the Queen of Roads, and one of the first and greatest examples of how the Romans transformed the world under their feet. Imagine you are a legionary soldier, perhaps a young recruit in the 2nd century. BCE, you stand at the southern gates of Rome, squinting at the long white ribbon that unspools beyond the city's protective walls. Paving stones shimmer in the midday sun, so bright they almost blind you. Ahead lies hundreds of miles southward to Capua, then onward to Brundisium on the Adriatic coast, a road that cuts like a blade through marshes, rolling hills, and rocky cliffs, a promise that Rome's reach will never stop. But this story isn't just about mighty armies, marching in perfect ranks or clever, generals moving war elephants across Italy. It's about the slow, patient art of laying stone upon stone, a feat as much about the humdrum slog of laborers, surveyors, and engineers as about conquest and glory. Where did these roads begin? Not with emperors issuing grand decrees, but with teams of surveyors, grammatici, moving quietly through fields and forests with long rods, plumb lines, and the ancient groma, an oddly simple device of cross-shaped arms strung with lead weights. With these tools, they sighted straight lines over hills and valleys, marking the path that would become a road. Roman roads were famous for their straightness. Even when the terrain defied logic, steep inclines, swamps, forests dense with oak, the Romans often refused to bend or curve their way around. They believed a straight road was stronger, easier to defend, and faster for marching legions. So they cut through hillsides, drained marshes, and built causeways across rivers. Where a lesser civilization might have skirted a swamp, the Romans dug ditches and heaped stone foundations until a firm, dry road appeared. Picture a crew of laborers at dawn, slaves, soldiers, free poor pickaxes biting into stubborn rock. Some carry wicker baskets of gravel and earth. Others wrestle heavy paving stones into place, each piece shaped by hand with iron tools. Supervising it all is the curator Virum, the official in charge of road construction for that stretch. He walks the line, his tablet covered in rough plans, inspecting the camber and gradient to ensure rainwater will run off, not pool. The process is methodical, layer upon layer. First, they clear the ground down to solid earth, sometimes dig in deep trenches to find bedrock. This bottom layer is compacted, flattened with wooden rammers until it's hard as stone. On top of that goes the stadamen, a layer of large, rough stones to provide a strong base. Next comes the rudis, smaller stones mixed with lime mortar, forming a thick, stable core. Above that, the nucleus, a finer layer of gravel or sand, carefully leveled. Finally comes the surface you would feel beneath your sandals. The summum dorsum, large, flat paving stones fitted so tightly that weeds struggled to grow between them. Even centuries later, these stones, worn smooth by the passing of feet, hooves, and wagon wheels, would outlast empires. Stand now at the edge of this freshly laid road. Hear the rhythmic thud of hammers, the scrape of stone against stone. Smell the sweat of men and the scent of hot tar. If they seal cracks to keep out the rain. To the side, mile markers, milliaria, rise from the verge every 1,000 paces. Carved with the distance back to the Forum in Rome, the heart of the empire. What is remarkable is that these roads were not only built for armies. Yes, legions used them to march swiftly to distant provinces. But merchants, farmers, messengers, and pilgrims walked them too. They carried amphorae of wine from the vineyards of Gaul, baskets of olives from Hispania, scrolls of philosophy from Athens. A road was a bridge between worlds. The Via Appia itself began in 312 BCE under Appius Claudius Caecus, who dreamed of a solid, dry way south through the Pontine marshes. That swampy stretch was nearly impassable in rainy seasons, a breeding ground for mosquitoes, bandits, and the misfortune that comes when armies are bogged down in muck. Appius ordered causeways, drainage ditches, and stone embankments to carry the road across. Laborers toiled for months in chest-deep water, mud sucking at their feet. Many fell sick with fevers, the price paid for straight lines across treacherous lands, but the payoff was extraordinary. Where once a trader's cart might sink axle-deep in mud, now it rattled briskly along stone slabs. Where a messenger might have taken days to find a safe crossing through marshland, now he moved unimpeded, carrying orders that could change the fate of a province. By the height of the empire, more than 250,000 miles of Roman roads crisscrossed Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. They linked towns, cities, ports, and frontiers. Roadside inns, mansionese sprang up every 15 to 20 miles, offering travelers a place to rest, swap horses, or share the latest gossip. Milestones reminded each passerby, "You are never far from Rome." Every road pointed homeward. To walk these roads was to move through layers of human survival, the sweat of the stonecutter's hammer, the engineer's scribbled plans, the legionary's dusty march. Each straight line was a promise. Here, empire defies chaos. Yet for all their permanence, Roman roads were not immortal. Stones cracked under centuries of carts and hoofbeats. Weeds and roots forced their way through the seams as the empire's grip loosened. Some roads fell into disrepair, their ditches clogged, their mile markers tumbled into hedgerows. But traces remained, buried under fields, hidden beneath modern highways, waiting to remind us how a civilization carved its endurance into the earth itself. So, tonight, as you rest, think of this. What does it mean for a people to believe so fiercely in connection that they would cut mountains apart, drain swamps, and straighten rivers, also that a lone traveler might step from one world into the next, stone by stone, mile by mile? As the Roman road winds onward, it does more than connect places. It gathers people, stories, and commerce into its stony spine. The engineers laid the path, but it was the travelers who gave it life, step by step, cart by cart, mile by mile. Picture a crisp spring morning on the Via Aurelia, that well-worn route hugging the Tyrrhenian coastline from Rome northward into Etruria. The sun has yet to burn off the mist clinging to olive groves and scattered villas. The road is already alive. A mule train creaks along, panniers bulging with clay amphories sloshing with wine from inland estates. A group of legionaries passes at a brisk march, the thud of their caligae echoing off the paving stones. Behind them lumbers a broad-wheeled cart loaded with stone for a new aqueduct in a nearby settlement. Yet not every traveler on Rome's roads was a soldier or merchant. Ordinary people walked these same miles, pilgrims on their way to sacred shrines, farmers leading flocks to distant markets, slaves bought and sold at remote outposts. Every road became a slender thread binding distant lives into the vast tapestry of empire. If you could stand at a busy crossroads for a day, you'd witness an entire world pass by. A senator's litter borne high by sweating porters, a province haggling over tolls, a wandering storyteller who earns a night's lodging at a roadside inn by spinning tales of gods and heroes. Some roads were quiet farm tracks. Others thrummed with the daily pulse of a continent on the move. But travel was not all speed and convenience. Even the finest Roman road was still an arduous undertaking. Travelers needed places to rest, eat, and find shelter from sudden storms. This is where the mansionese, state-run posting stations, and the humble calpone, the inns and taverns, come in. Imagine coming upon one such outpost at dusk. Smoke drifts from a hearth behind rough stone walls. A wooden sign creaks in the evening breeze, marking the inn's name, perhaps the painted figure of Mercury, god of travelers, gazing down from a faded fresco. Within, the smell of stew, thick with lentils and garlic, mixes with the sour tang of cheap wine and unwashed bottas. The calpone were not places of luxury. Their straw pallets were often infested with fleas, their food barely enough to fill a weary belly. Yet for the lone trader or farmer caught between milestones as night fell, they offered something invaluable: safety. Bandits roamed the dark stretches between towns, waiting for a careless traveler to stray too far from the road's protective watch. More respectable travelers, officials, couriers, or soldiers might instead stop at a mancio. These state-run stations dotted the main roads every 15 to 20 miles, spaced to match a day's travel on foot or by horse. They were basic but dependable, with stabling for mounts, fresh horses for couriers, and modest sleeping quarters. The cursus publicus, Rome's official postal service, relied on these outposts to carry messages at remarkable speed across thousands of miles. Picture a tired courier riding in at sunset. He swings off his horse, legs stiff from the journey. A fresh mount stands waiting, its bridle held by a stable boy who's been tending animals all day. No time to linger, the message pouch strapped to the courier's chest must reach the governor's villa by dawn. In the soft glow of an oil lamp, he gulps down a handful of olives and flatbread, takes a skin of watered wine, and mounts up again. Hoofbeats fade into the darkness, the road carrying news that could change the fate of a province by morning. The milestones, miliaria, reminded all who traveled that they were never truly lost. Every 1,000 paces, you'd pass one of these sturdy markers carved from local stone. They listed the distance back to Rome, the name of the emperor who ordered the road's repair or extension, and sometimes the local magistrate responsible for its upkeep. Think how comforting these markers must have been. Visible proof of the empire's hand, stretching even into wild borderlands. If you found yourself a stranger in foreign terrain, the milestone spoke clearly: Rome is here. Order exists. Keep walking. But who maintained these roads long after the first stones were laid? It was no small task. Harsh winters cracked paving stones. Swollen rivers washed out bridges. Weeds crept into the neat joints. Local officials were often responsible for repairs, but their work was paid for with taxes from nearby towns and estates. Rich landowners grudgingly contributed labor or money, understanding that a well-kept road meant their goods could reach markets faster, and soldiers could reach trouble spots just as quickly. Sometimes, a particularly wealthy patron might pay for a stretch of repairs and inscribe their name on a milestone for posterity. Such acts of generosity were rarely selfless. They were investments in reputation and influence. A road was not just a path for feet and wagons, it was a symbol of loyalty to Rome, a physical reminder that the reach of the Senate and the emperors was both local and imperial. Travel along these roads was often tedious and uncomfortable. The paving stones, while brilliant feats of engineering, turned hard and jarring under the iron-rimmed wheels of a cart. A traveler might wrap the wheels in leather strips to soften the ride, a small mercy that helped protect fragile cargo. In wet weather, sections of the road turned slick, dangerous for horses whose hooves could lose their grip, and always there was the constant dust, kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves, drifting onto tunics and into travel bread. Yet despite the hardships, the roads remained the arteries of survival. They allowed grain to flow from the farmlands of North Africa to the crowded hillsides of Rome. They carried wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, marble from Greece. They brought gods and stories, languages and laws to the furthest reaches of empire. A stone mile by mile was not just a physical distance. It was a measure of Rome's promise that no subject was too remote to be reached. As dusk turns to night along the Via Appia, imagine a caravan huddled by a roadside fire. Oxen chew slowly on sparse grass. A merchant checks on crates, filled with glassware from the workshops of the Bay of Naples. A child stirs from a fitful nap, soothed by the distant clatter of hooves on stone. All of them trust that by dawn the road will carry them onward. The milestones will stand watch. The inns will open their gates, and the ruts worn deep by centuries of travelers will guide them, step by step, toward the next place and the next story. So tonight, ask yourself this as you rest your feet on your own road through time. How many hidden lives, how many forgotten journeys have been carved into the stones? beneath our modern highways. Each mile a whisper from travelers who walked before us, carrying their hopes down roads that seem to stretch on forever. By now, you can almost feel the hard stones under your sandals. You can hear the faint creak of wagon wheels, the distant tramp of legionaries on the march, the murmur of traders haggling in the shade of a wayside tavern. You know these roads well enough to walk them in your mind? So let's follow one more traveler, not a conquering general or a senator in silk robes, but a simple merchant's apprentice at the empire's edge, somewhere on the limes, the vast frontier that once marked where Roman power gave way to the wilderness. Picture him trudging northward along the Via Augusta in Hispania or the Via Traiana in the Balkans, his small pack slung over his shoulder, dusty feet stepping between ruts worn deep by centuries of carts. The milestones are older here, their inscriptions faded. The next Mancio is a full day's walk away. In his pouch are coins minted in Rome, a few scraps of bread, and maybe a letter tucked into his tunic. An order from his master to trade a bale of wool for barrels of oil or iron tools. Nothing grand, just survival. At the road's edge, a villa's walls crumble into ruin. Once, the landowner's wealth came from crops sent to distant cities by these roads, carried in ox carts and traded in bustling markets. Now the household struggles. Raiders from beyond the border probe deeper each winter. Soldiers are spread thin. Miles of stone demanding more men than the empire can spare. This is the slow unraveling, not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet, steady fraying. The roads remain, but the funds for maintenance dry up. Local governors, once eager to outdo each other by paving new stretches, now hoard their coin for private armies or fortress walls. The old milestones stand crooked in the weeds, toppled by time, chipped by farmers who steal their stone for barns or fences. Yet still, people walk these roads. They have no choice. A worn road, even neglected, is better than none at all. It's safer than bush trails, faster than forging paths through wild woods. So they pick their way over broken stones, around potholes and eroded culverts. Traders still lead their mules to market. Soldiers still trudge to far-flung garrisons. Pilgrims still dream of shrines at the road's end. Sometimes a stretch falls into ruin altogether. A bridge collapses in a spring flood and is never rebuilt. A mountain pass clogs with snow, the road beneath hidden for decades. Nature takes back what it can, sending brambles through cracked paving stones, saplings rooting in ancient ditches. But the memory remains etched in local lore. There was once a Roman road here, a straight line to the world beyond. And here is the paradox of the Roman road. Its strength is its stubbornness. Unlike wooden palisades or earthen forts that rot and vanish, a road endures in some shape long after its empire is gone. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall like tides. Peasants guide their wagons along rutted tracks that follow the old lines. Medieval pilgrims march to distant cathedrals, step for step along ancient stone beds. Even in the Middle Ages, kings and bishops issue orders to repair bits of Roman road, recognizing their worth when so much else is lost. When you look at modern maps of Europe, you can still trace their ghosts. Major highways and rail lines echo the same paths first surveyed by Roman grammatici. That straight line through the swamp? It's now a motorway exit. The causeway across a misty moor? It's under a railroad embankment. Every mile is a whisper of continuity. Perhaps you wonder what the roads meant to the people who built them. For the legionary sweating under a burning sun, the road was a duty, a grueling task before a greater conquest. For the merchant's apprentice, it was hope, a chance to reach new markets, to earn a few more coins. For the farmers along its edge, it was survival and burdened both taxes to keep it clear, tolls to pay for its use, but also a lifeline in famine years when food from distant lands rolled in on carts. For Rome itself, the roads were a promise. They declared that chaos would yield to order, that the wild edges could be bound with stone and rule. They made the vast empire feel smaller, the distances between people shorter. They carried not just goods, but ideas, laws. languages, religions, dreams of citizenship and belonging. And when the empire's banners fell, and the legions no longer marched, the roads stayed behind, a reminder that even when human power falters, the marks we carve into the earth can last. They remind us that survival is not always a grand battle, but the slow, steady laying of stones, the filling of potholes, the passing of footsteps across centuries. So, as you rest tonight, picture one final image: the apprentice asleep beside the road, his pack as a pillow, the stars wheeling overhead as countless travelers did before him. The stones beneath him hold memories of Roman sandals, barbarian boots, medieval pilgrims, and the rumble of modern wheels yet to come. A road is never truly dead while people still dream of the place it leads. So I'll leave you with this thought for your dreams. What lines are we carving today that will guide footsteps tomorrow? What paths, laid stone by stone, will remain when our own empires have become stories whispered? Down the road's endless miles? Sleep well, and may you always find your way home, mile by mile. If you stepped outside into the frostbitten air during these strange waking hours, you'd find that you were rarely alone. A neighbor might be tending her goats, brushing straw from their flanks to keep the frost from biting too deep. Another might be crouched by the barn, retightening a fence before the dawn winds rise. In towns and villages, the glow of rushlights could be seen flickering behind shutters like tiny stars trapped in timber-bird houses. The medieval night was not silent. Dogs barked in distant farmyards. A cock might crow too early, confused by the wan light of the moon. Somewhere down the lane, you might hear muffled conversation, a family murmuring over prayers, or two lovers whispering sweet words, while the household dozed on the other side of a thin partition. Why did this first sleep and second sleep pattern exist? Partly it was practical. Without electric lights, humans naturally drifted toward a rhythm set by the sun. In winter, nights were long, sometimes 14 or 15 hours of darkness. For people who rose with the dawn and worked fields or workshops until dusk, it made sense to split that long stretch of darkness into more manageable pieces. But the candle hours were more than just practical. They were seen, too, as a blessed time for the soul. Monks and nuns rose for nocturnal prayers known as the vigils or matins. Their chants drifted through monastery cloisters long before the cocks crow. Ordinary folk mirrored this. Wonderful. Let's continue that gentle journey into the hush of the medieval night. We'll pick up right where we left off, standing outside under a sky so dark it humbles you, listening for the soft rustle of neighbors awake in the candle hours. But for most, these hours were simple, domestic. Some mended clothes by rushlight, stitches slow and uneven but good enough for work, tunics and rough linens. Some tended to the sick, checking fevers in the hush when the house was still. A mother might feed an infant, rocking gently as the embers glowed. Others simply sat and reflected on the day just past, their thoughts soft and unhurried. Doctors and scholars of the time even advised that the watch could be good for your health. A respected physician might say the break gave your digestion a chance to settle, your mind a chance to unwind the humors before slipping back into deeper dreams. Some even claimed it was the best time for conception, as the body was rested but the mind was calm. Nature's quiet hour for bringing forth new life. Outside the cottage walls, the monastery bells marked the same dark stretch. For monks and nuns, this was not just a habit but holy routine. Vigils and matins broke the night, chanting psalms by candlelight. In cold stone chapels, their voices echoing under vaulted arches while the rest of the world dozed. The rule of Saint Benedict, a foundational guide for monastic life, divided the day and night into clear segments of prayer, work, and rest. This was the divine office, the heartbeat of monastic survival. Somewhere beyond the monastery walls, a shepherd might doze against a tree trunk, ears pricked for wolves. A midwife might be roused from first sleep by an urgent knock. A birth could not wait for the sun. The world in these hours was never truly still. And then slowly the watch ended. Sleep returned like a tide creeping back over sand. With the prayers murmured, the embers poked, the shutters checked, the family would slip back beneath their blankets. Second sleep took them until dawn, the final stretch before roosters crowed. Before oxen were yoked and markets opened. What changed this rhythm? Why did segmented sleep fade into memory, leaving only hints in folklore and fragments in old texts? Much of the shift came with artificial light. The slow spread of street lamps, candles, and eventually gas and electric bulbs pushed back the darkness. People stayed up later, filled the night with more activity, and stretched the day longer than nature intended. In the growing cities of the 17th and 18th centuries, taverns and coffeehouses buzzed with late-night chatter. The industrial age brought rigid work hours and tight shifts in factories. Sleep, once a flexible cycle, was squeezed into a single block, more efficient, more modern. Yet here in these old cottages and cloisters, we glimpse a different way of being. The candle hours remind us that humans once lived in concert with the rise and fall of sun and moon. They remind us that darkness was not always something to fear, but something to embrace, a time for the body to rest, the mind to wander, the soul to whisper its quiet prayers. So, tonight, if you wake in the middle of your own sleep, try not to curse the clock or worry at the ceiling. Think instead of the peasant stirring the hearth coals, the monk chanting matins, the neighbor whispering secrets across the hedge. You are not so different from them. Hold this thought gently. What secret life waits in the middle hours of our nights? If we only dare to listen and remember that sometimes the dark can be its own strange light. So here we are, resting in the fragile hush between the first sleep and the second, a world suspended between dreams and waking. The candle guttered out an hour ago. The last embers in the hearth crackle and shift, sending up faint curls of smoke that blend with the frost creeping at the cottage door. This was the moment when time felt elastic, when people, half awake and half asleep, held conversations with the darkness itself. But like all things, this pattern would not last forever. Just as empires crumble and roads crack under centuries of footfall, the old ways of sleeping would slip away, piece by piece. It didn't happen all at once. For centuries, this double sleep, the biphasic or segmented pattern, was as ordinary as milking cows at dawn or locking the gate before dusk. Yet with each generation, the world grew a little brighter and the nights a little shorter. Oil lamps became cheaper, candles more plentiful. In cities, streets flickered with lanterns. And later, gaslights turned night into a realm of endless possibility, where once only monks and watchmen prowled the night. Now shopkeepers stayed open late, artisans worked by lamplight, and taverns brimmed with the laughter of people who could afford to stretch their waking hours well past dusk. London, Paris, Florence, Amsterdam, all these old cities began to glow. The deep, blank stretches of darkness shrank under the warm haze of flame and gas. By the time the industrial age dawned, time itself had changed. The village bell that once marked matins and vespers was replaced by the relentless tick of factory clocks. Shift work demanded that sleep be predictable, compressed, and obedient to the whistle's blast at dawn. Sleep doctors and health reformers, those early guardians of modern wellness, began to write that this strange habit of waking in the middle of the night was unhealthy, even primitive. People learned to treat wakefulness at 2 a.m. as a problem to fix, not a quiet gift to embrace. And yet, the old ways never vanished entirely. In small hamlets and isolated farms, you could still find people who drifted awake for an hour before returning to bed. Folklorists in the 19th century recorded whispers of the watch. In rural Ireland and the Scottish Highlands, the soft creak of floorboards, the hush of prayers in the dark. But the candles burned lower each generation, until at last the candle hours were only a memory. Today we speak of insomnia and restless nights as ailments. We turn to pills, blue light blockers, or podcasts to trick our minds back to sleep. But in truth, there is nothing unnatural about stirring in the small hours. It is a ghost of our older selves, the echo of the watch still alive in our bones. If you could stand in one of those old timber-bird cottages, now, your feet on cold stone floors, your hands shielding a flickering rushlight, you'd sense how different the dark felt back then. It wasn't just absence, it was presence. It was a time for hidden conversations, secret worries, and dreams that drifted into waking thoughts. Like mist across a moonlit field, the poet Chaucer alluded to it. Medieval legal records show confessions of crimes that happened in the watch. Letters from farmers in the 16th century speak of first sleep and second sleep, as if everyone would know exactly what they meant, because they did. It was a survival strategy in a world lit only by fire and moon. Sometimes, these broken hours could be frightening. The darkness pressed against the thin cottage walls. Wolves prowled the village edge. Witches and spirits were said to slip between worlds. More easily in these liminal moments, a child might be taught to cross themselves 3 times when they woke, to guard against the wandering dead, but more often, the candle hours were tender and ordinary. A mother nursing a baby, a father mending a boot soled by the embers, an old woman sitting by the shutter, counting her rosary beads one by one as the world held its breath between sleeps, and as the watch gave way to second sleep, dreams came easier, softer somehow, as if the mind, having tasted wakefulness, could sink more deeply into its own secret garden. The rooster's crow might be the first sound to stir the family from their second rest. The gray wash of dawn would seep through the shutters. Coals would be poked back to life. Another day of toil in fields or shops would begin, built on the quiet, hidden foundation of that long, old night. There's something comforting in knowing that for centuries, people moved in and out of dreams without the tyranny of clocks or the glow of screens, that they embraced the dark as something useful, even sacred, a chance to slip out of the rush of daylight and into a private time when nothing was demanded. But quiet thought. So tonight, if you find yourself awake, when you think you shouldn't be, at 2 or 3 in the morning, staring into the hush, remember the candle hours. You are not broken. You are simply human, shaped by generations who learned that the night has its own hidden rhythm, and so we close the shutters on this story with a question for your dreams. What forgotten rituals, what small kindnesses for the mind and soul might we rediscover if we made peace with the dark once more? If we welcomed our wakeful nights as a gift instead of a burden? Close your eyes and imagine this. You are a simple farmer's wife, in the 12th century, living in a small timber-bird cottage on the edge of a damp field. The day's work has left your hands cracked and sore, but worse is the dull, throbbing pain deep inside your jaw. It is a pain you have known for months, sometimes flaring so fiercely that it feels as if your skull itself might split in two. There is no dentist to call, no comforting hum of modern drills, no numbing syringes or x-rays to pinpoint what's wrong. Your pain has only one explanation: the toothworm. For thousands of years, people across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East believed that toothaches were caused by tiny worms burrowing inside the teeth, gnawing at the roots from within. This belief was not mere superstition plucked from thin air. After all, what else could explain the way a rotting tooth seemed to hollow out from the inside? What else could make sense of the sudden, sharp stabs of pain, the sense that something alive was moving deep in the bone? Even the ancient Sumerians wrote about toothworms. So did scholars in medieval monasteries, who copied old medical texts from Greek and Arabic sources. In these pages, you might find elaborate hand-drawn diagrams of worms curled inside a cracked molar, a monstrous thought that lodged itself deep in the medieval mind. Now, step back into that cottage with the farmer's wife. Her jaw aches so badly that she can't chew the coarse rye bread. Her children eat without complaint. Each bite sends sparks of agony through her head. The local barber surgeon, part barber, part healer, visits once a season. Carrying a kit of rusty tongs and small knives, he might offer to pull the tooth, but such a violent solution is risky. Infection can spread. Teeth can break at the root, leaving shards buried in tender gums. Instead, she tries the remedies passed down by her mother, who learned them from a local cunning woman or a scrap of a monk's herbal treatise. Cloves, if she can get them, precious and rare, traded from the East and worth their weight in silver. She might chew a piece to numb the pain, or she might hold a warm cloth soaked in wine and vinegar against her jaw, hoping to coax the worm from its hidden nest. In some places, small rituals and charms offered extra hope. A healer might whisper incantations, calling on saints or even pagan spirits still, lingering in rural corners of Christendom. One Old English charm calls for heating henbane seeds and letting their fumes drift into the mouth, the bitter smoke believed to stupefy the worm and drive it out. If you listen closely in the night, you can almost hear her muttering. Saint Apollonia, the patroness of tooth sufferers, became a figure of hope for many in medieval Europe. Legend says that when Roman persecutors tried to force her to renounce her faith, they shattered her teeth and tore them from her mouth. In pain and faith, she became the one to whom all aching mouths prayed. Her image, carved in stone on church walls or painted in manuscript margins, often shows her holding a pair of pliers with a tooth gripped tight, a reminder that the suffering of the mouth was seen and understood, but saints and prayers could not always hush the pain. Nor did leeches or poultices of crushed herbs, or the sour wine rinses so often prescribed by learned monks. In some villages, people believed the worm must be lured out. One folk practice involved placing a sweet concoction, honey mixed with oil, near the aching tooth. The hope was that the worm, greedy for sweetness, would crawl out to be plucked away. It never did, of course, but the belief lingered. As stubborn as the ache itself. So, what was really happening inside these suffering mouths? Centuries later, we know the answer. The agony came not from worms, but from cavities born of decay, tiny microbes invisible to the naked eye, fed on leftover food and sugars, producing acid that slowly wore through the enamel. Once the hard outer shell was breached, the pulp inside, nerves, blood vessels, tender tissue became a raw battlefield of infection. But for the medieval mind, a worm felt true. After all, didn't fruit left too long on the table show the same trick? A fresh apple, bruised and soft, often revealed a hole bored by a hidden worm. Why should teeth be any different? The strange thing is that from Persia to France, healers wrote about similar remedies, some drawn from ancient Galenic medicine, others from local tradition. In the Taquinum Sanitatis, an illustrated health handbook copied by scribes in the late Middle Ages, you might find cloves, pepper, mustard seeds, or myrrh listed as ways to calm the gnawing within. A wealthy merchant could afford imported spices, but for peasants, even these small comforts were rare luxuries. Instead, they lived with the ache day after day, season after season, the toothworm their constant bedfellow, a reminder that pain was part of survival. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a world where a single toothache could alter a life, where an abscessed molar might swell until it threatened the very bone of the jaw, where no quiet dental chair or gentle anesthetic offered relief. Picture a mother whispering prayers to Saint Apollonia in the dark, hoping the worm would be merciful enough to leave her in peace, just for one night. And hold this thought in the candle hours. What strange ideas do we cling to today, as true as worms once were, waiting for the slow light of understanding to reveal what really gnaws at us from within? The toothworm might have felt like a curse, but the people who fought it were both ordinary and quietly heroic. They had no sterile tools, no antiseptic rinses, no tiny drills buzzing away decay. Instead, they made do with what they had: rough iron forceps, sharp knives, boiling water, prayers, charms, and the wealth of handed-down herbal lore. Step into the dim, smoky corner of a medieval town square and you might see a man in a stained leather apron, the local barber surgeon. He trims beards, lances boils, sets broken bones, and pulls teeth all in the same long day. His tools clink and rattle in a canvas satchel, crude forceps, a hooked instrument to leva out stubborn molars, a thin metal probe to test which tooth is rotten. There is no trained dentist, not yet, only this man, whose steady hand could mean the difference between agony and some measure of relief. Picture him leaning over a patient in the open air. There is no anesthetic, just a leather strap to bite down on. A stout apprentice holds the sufferer's shoulders while the surgeon grips the tooth with iron forceps. A twist, a crack, a cry muffled against the strap, then the rotten thing is out. Worm or no worm, and the patient slumps forward in a haze of pain and relief. A rag soaked in wine is pressed to the bleeding socket. Perhaps the ache will subside now. Or perhaps the empty hole will fester, bringing fever and worse. In rural hamlets, where no barber surgeon passed by, people turned instead to local healers, the wise women and cunning folk, who knew every root and leaf that could soothe or numb. They were not trained by any university, but by the slow schooling of generations who learned what plants would deaden pain, however briefly. The cunning woman's cottage was often a place of contradictions. Christian saints and pagan, charmed side by side. Dried bundles of herbs hung from beams, sage, rosemary, yarrow, henbane, nettles. A wooden chest held precious ointments in tiny clay pots, beeswax salves infused with oil of cloves, or garlic mashed into a pungent paste. One old manuscript from the 14th century describes a cure for the worm. Take of garlic and salt. Pound together, bind upon the jaw with a cloth overnight. Another recommends heating a mix of henbane seeds on a hot iron and directing the fumes into the mouth, the idea being that the worm, overcome by the noxious smoke, would slither out. Some folk healers swore by charms, rhymes, whispered 3 times, while circling the patient's head with a twig of ash or rowan. The words might mingle scraps of Latin, half-remembered prayers, and the old dialect of village secrets. Did they work? Perhaps not in any medical sense, but the human mind is powerful, and sometimes belief can soothe pain that medicine cannot touch. So here we stand at the crossroads of the medieval mind and the modern age, a place where candlelit charms and rusty forceps slowly gave way to polished instruments, sterile rooms, and the quiet hum of drills and suction tubes. But before the worm could vanish, the world had to change in ways that would have seemed like sorcery to the peasant woman. Clutching her swollen jaw in the cottage gloom, knowledge, like a lantern, spread slowly, and the path to understanding was neither smooth nor straight. By the late Middle Ages, scholars and physicians were already beginning to question the old wisdom, though the toothworm clung stubbornly to the popular imagination. Renaissance anatomists dissected cadavers, drawing exquisite diagrams of bones, muscles, and organs. They saw that teeth were not hollow tunnels for worms to nest in, but solid structures with roots, nerves, and pulp. Still, even with better anatomy, the cause of decay remained hidden. There were no microscopes yet to reveal the tiny bacterial armies at war with enamel. Instead, learned doctors offered new theories. Corrupt humors that soured the body and rotted the teeth from within. Imbalances of heat and cold that made the gums swell. Each guess chipped away at the old worm, but none quite drove it away. What finally banished the worm was not a single discovery, but a slow convergence of small revelations. By the 17th century, Dutch scientist Antonia van Leeuwenhoek crafted lenses so fine he could peer into drops of saliva and see animalcules, the tiny, wriggling bacteria he described in letters that astonished Europe's scientific minds. He did not yet connect these creatures to decay, but the idea was planted. There were unseen worlds within us, alive and capable of harm. As microscopes improved, the notion of the toothworm shriveled under glass. Scholars and physicians debated whether these invisible beings, these germs, might be the true culprits behind the dull ache that had tormented millions for centuries. It took another 2 centuries before the germ theory of disease would become accepted dogma. But by then, the seeds were sown, the toothworm was dying in the shadows, replaced by a new understanding that infection, not some burrowing creature, was the enemy. Meanwhile, the art of dentistry itself was crawling from the shadows of the marketplace and the rough hands of the barber surgeon. In the 18th century, a Parisian named Pierre Fauchard began publishing works that described methods for cleaning and filling teeth, so precise and gentle that he is still called the father of modern dentistry. He championed hygiene, routine cleaning, and the use of instruments far less brutal than the tongs of a traveling tooth drawer. As industrialization spread, so did sugar, the sweet delight that carried a hidden price. Tooth decay became rampant, but so too did the tools to fight it. The toothbrush, once a luxury for nobles, became a staple of the common household by the 19th century. Tooth powders and pastes with chalk, charcoal, and minty herbs promised fresh breath and cleaner smiles. And though cavities still came, they were no longer blamed on worms that writhed unseen. In some rural corners, though, the legend lingered. Old folk tales of the toothworm survived deep into the 19th century, especially in places where modern medicine arrived slowly. A grandmother in the Scottish Highlands might still mutter about the worm's hunger when her grandson cried out with a molar swollen and red. A village healer in Eastern Europe might still burn herbs by the hearth, half from old habit, half because sometimes the ritual soothed as much as the salve. When modern dentistry finally arrived in these remote places, it carried the promise of relief, not from a worm, but from the real culprits, bacteria, poor hygiene, and the sweet temptations that fed them. Dental schools opened their doors. Anesthesia transformed the patient's ordeal from agony to a manageable discomfort. Extraction was no longer the first and only answer. Now there were fillings, crowns, and eventually root canals. St. Apollonia, the patroness of tooth sufferers, remained. Her image still adorns churches and prayer cards, though her devotees are fewer now that steel instruments and local anesthetic do what prayers once begged for. In the grand cathedrals where her statue stands, you can still see pilgrims, leaving tiny silver teeth nailed to the walls, a quiet echo of an older fear that will never fully disappear. If you visit a dental museum today, you may find small glass jars labeled toothworms, not actual creatures. Of course, but artifacts showing how far we've come. Tiny bits of coiled wire or carved bone used in dubious treatments. Early drawings from medieval manuscripts. A cross-section of a molar with a worm like a fat maggot curled in its hollow. Each one is a testament to our need to make sense of pain, even if the story we tell ourselves is not quite true. So, tonight, as you run your tongue over your own teeth, clean, smooth, perhaps a little sore from a modern filling, remember the countless souls who whispered prayers to Saint Apollonia, who chewed cloves and garlic, who watched the smoke of henbane swirl around their heads. Remember how long it took to light the tiny world hidden inside the mouth. And remember, too, that the toothworm was not just a superstition, but a symbol of human endurance. It reminds us that we will always try to name our suffering, to find meaning in the ache, to tell stories that make the unseen feel less terrible in the dark. So I'll leave you with this gentle question for your dreams. What old worms still gnaw at the edges of our knowledge today, small, invisible truths that wait in the shadows, ready to reveal themselves when the light is finally strong enough to see? Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of aches, burrowing doubts, and all the small monsters that once kept us awake in the candle hours. Wonderful. Let's lace up our rough leather shoes, sling a battered satchel over our shoulder, and set off down the dusty road where countless weary souls once trudged, mile after mile in search of salvation, healing, or adventure. Every viewer matters, and you made this quiet story complete. Thank you. Sleep well, dream deep, and thank you for staying until the end.